All right, welcome back, friends and comrades, for our final session on intellectuals with C. Derick Varn. Today, you'll notice that we are hosting our final conversation here at Emancipations. The first 3 episodes you can check out on Varn Vlog. I'll put them in the show notes, in the show description. So episode 1, we looked at why, I guess the title was Why America is Anti-Intellectual. Which was looking at sort of a why we created sort of this huge reading list and bibliography. So this has been something like a kind of public seminar, but also research project, in part because Derick and I are starting to write together. So maybe it's a bit of an exercise in that. Our second session was on Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, and his very, I think, extremely interesting theory of intellectuals. Third session was on the scandal of class for intellectuals, with a focus on Mickles's The Iron Law of Oligarchy and Jacques Rancière's work on worker intellectuals. And today we are talking about the public intellectual is dead, long live the public intellectual, with a focus on a few readings. We're going to be talking about Richard Sennet, the sociologist Richard Sennet, in his 1977 book called The Fall of Public Man. We'll look at Russell Jacoby's The Last Intellectuals, which was very, very widely read and I think extremely important piece, really focusing on what's called the New York intellectuals, which we can define that as well. The subtitle of Jacoby's book is American Culture in the Age of Academia. We're also going to look at a short but very interesting essay by Emanuel Wallerstein entitled Radical Intellectuals in Liberal Society. And finally, we'll look at Andrea Long Chu, Pulitzer Prize-winning critic, who is our contemporary, I think literally the same age as we are, studied philosophy at NYU with Avital Ronell, and wrote a series of book reviews, pieces of criticism for a number of publications. One of them we're going to be talking about today is called Authority. So that's our agenda. Now, I feel like perhaps the best place to sort of begin here is Jacoby's suggestion of the what he calls the conclusion of his work is after the last intellectuals. And he speculates a number of interesting points regarding the kind of decline of the public intellectual. The first and foremost here is the idea that for the majority of prestige publications, he does a sort of empirical analysis of the backgrounds and occupations of the critics and of the intellectuals that write for these publications, like the New York Review of Books or the New Yorker or some of the prestige ones, Harper's, etc. And he shows that at its heyday, what made American intellectual life so vibrant, so dynamic, was actually the fact that many intellectuals had a full occupation as freelance critics, freelance figures. This was the heyday of the New York intellectuals themselves. Of course, Edmund Wilson is sort of a huge example. All of the kind of New York Trotskyists emerge here as well. Max Eastman, Max Shachtman, Irving Howe, etc. And so there's that fact. And then the other fact, of course, is that the vast majority of what is permitted to be intellectual has to have the letterhead of academia associated with it. One's occupation must be in a university to qualify as an intellectual, putting aside how you are valorized by the wider establishment. That's just, and Jacoby thinks this is absolutely suffocating. He's like, why can't librarians also be public intellectuals? Why has this become taboo or not allowed, right? And so he makes this point. I think the other big point that he makes is not so much a commentary about digital media, the rise of Facebook, the rise of X. Neither is Sennet quite concerned with that.
I mean, we are dealing with 20 years before any of that happened. So
Well, true, but there's an epilogue for Sennet's book that does consider Facebook, and he basically says these trends of the loss of the public were afoot long before the digital revolution.
I think I read a different version than you. By that I mean I think I read the original printing. I don't think I read the updated one. I don't remember this.
Yeah, it's a prologue, the 40th year prologue.
Okay.
Came out after Facebook emerges in 2007. Yeah. But nonetheless, the point being is that these trends are driven by institutional power structures and dynamics. I think you could provide a kind of gloss of a political economic dimension, which Andrea Long Chu, she focuses on a bit at the end of her essay on authority. The fact that, what is it? I'll quote Jacoby. He says, career writers that function as writers for their career make up only 5% of all writers. Only 5%. And in 1976, the average annual pay from writing that writers received is $5,000. And he says, I think if you adjust that for inflation, etc., things basically have remained the same. And now here's the caveat. That includes award-winning writers. That also includes award-winning writers. So the idea that there is a kind of caste of a small echelon of elite tastemakers and critics is, of course, true. I think this is without question. But at the same time, we're talking about a field, public intellectual field, which is pre-selects based on academic affiliation on the one hand. On the other hand, it's far from meritocratic. But I do feel that perhaps there is something. I mean, what do you make of this entrepreneurial dimension of it all? How do you assess that? First of all, I guess we're jumping right into the economics of it.
Well, if you think about it as a petite bourgeois profession versus a professional profession, and I know that sounds like a redundant statement, but let's kind of parse that out for a second. A petite bourgeois profession has to deal with the opinions of the general public court, which means they do have to write and have some appeal to a relatively large range of classes within society. In the 40s, 50s, and 60s, it is true that the average brick maker, like my granddad, probably did not read Lionel Trilling. But there were people who did. And that idea would have been relatively ingrained in these thinkers. Whereas you and I have both been through formal academia, and I've talked about Jeff Smith's Disciplined Minds before, but I'll talk about it again. There is a way in which you are trained. Like I'm literally trained as a poet, and I'm trained as a poet to write for other poets when I get my MFA. I had to, in some degree, unlearn that my audience was just my quote-unquote peers, which is not even a class. It's a substrata of a substrata of a class that understands the general tradition, the jargon, etc. When for example, what I found interesting about this is that you would think in some ways in the Substack era and the WordPress era too, which led to things like Zero Books and like Zed Books, weirdly similar names, where you had a lot of academics that were pushed out into the general public because there was not enough jobs for them, or the jobs weren't prestigious enough, and they needed to have publications. And they realized that writing for academic journals meant literally 20 people might read what they had to say unless they were in the top 1% of academics. So They blogged, those blogs got popular books out, etc., etc. And you had people talking about, I don't know, Graham Harmon, who watched HBO shows in 2012. That was a thing that happened, but that doesn't bring us back to this pre-1940s intellectual, because there are conditions of this petit bourgeois culture that interfaces with broad classes that wouldn't happen even when these new public intellectuals, who might not work, they might be like us, they might only kind of work in universities. Like, I teach at a community college sometimes, I do go to academic conferences, but again, kind of as I want to. And yet I have to admit, I'm still trained like an academic. Like, I still go about my pedagogical framework that way. I was thinking about this. I was reading another book because I interviewed the author, Edward Baring's Vulgar Marxism on the Pedagogical Framework, and the way that led people to write between the 1890s and the 1930s. And we don't really see a lot of citation, for example, in Marxist writing until Lenin. And that's not because Lenin is writing like an academic, actually, even though he does cite like an academic, actually kind of weirdly, but it's because he's trying to model a thinking process, right? But we do this because we're taught that that's what scholars do. You cite people, you work out the arguments through citation, you use the correct jargon, you semantically police that jargon. The way that you are coming out of it, if you're a public intellectual pre-1940, you have a physical community space in which you are inhabiting that is very much rooted not in a state ideological apparatus, but in a commercial apparatus. Cafes, coffee houses, city blocks. The language is plain and vigorous. If we think about what I might mean by that, like, it's written, I think about like the few academics that write that way today. Christopher Lasch wrote this way. Lester McIntyre wrote this way. There's very little technical jargon in their work, but it does have elaborate arguments spelled out, right? There's no shorthand. There's very little, I'm just going to refer to X. I'm going to assume you know what the reference truly means and pull that out, because we are assuming that the audience is educated, but not specialist in anything. We are assuming that they can basically read at a very high level, but not necessarily need to know the kind of jargon that comes out of specialization. Now, people will sometimes think that jargon is unique to academia. It's not. Anyone's ever like done, I don't know, anything like, I don't know, built a shelf, you have specialized jargon. It's just that in academia, technical jargon and theoretical jargon is often contested, so the meaning is even less clear. And lastly, the income of academic intellectuals, even when they are, on blogs or whatever, is largely through things like grants, tenure, or salaried positions. You are not getting paid piecemeal per work, and you don't really care how large your audience is, because that doesn't affect your pay. I think that really does change things. Does that mean that one is more meritocratic than the other? No, it's just, if you think about where in society they're located, the academic is located basically in a way to get grants. And those come from two places: the super wealthy or the government. And that's where they come from. The freelance journalist wants to sell books, and the more appeal that they have, the more books they can sell.
Right.
And thus the motivations are just fundamentally different.
Right. No, it's true. And I mean, so you know this having worked in the publishing industry, but you know, to qualify as a best-selling author, you need to sell 5,000 copies of your book. If you do that, that's a modest degree of income, depending on which publisher you go with and the contract that you signed, how much independence you have, and other various factors. But even then, it's not as if you're rich. It's still, in fact, again, so the economic incentive lends itself to an austerity field and climate in which those who have grants, those who have academic comfort, are more inclined to enter into the space. Now, let me propose, and I want your take on this. You know, what Jacoby suggests, and I think I kind of agree with him, is that two things have kind of coalesced that have been problematic in terms of this radical hegemony of academics being the only occupation that can be critical intellectuals, which is that academics build a habitus where their own thought taboos are then translated into or smuggled into the public.
Mm-hmm.
And this is reproduced. Now, that's not to say that the views of academics are kind of like a herd-like mentality. I'm not necessarily suggesting that. But as we've said in the past 3 episodes, there certainly is a great deal of pressure and groupthink that emerges from academia. I think a lot of this is interesting because in the Trump era, now we're in the second Trump era, so much of dissident, what we mean by dissident intellectuals, is so unmoored from anything resembling a coherent left-right dichotomy, where so much of this ideological disarray and turbulence is no longer anchored to anything traditionally sensible. And that is obviously, in my view, a major, major problem. It's a major problem for the transmission of intellectual thought. It's a problem for the left because we simply lose a lot of very strong intellectual voices. We lose them and they veer off into no man's land, or they become reactionaries, right? Because there is a certain incentive to become a reactionary, independent thinker. H.L. Mencken emerges as an interesting example of this historically in the American scene. Jacoby makes an interesting point, though, about Mencken, which was that even though he's the kind of historical paradigm of the right-wing dissident, he actually did possess something which is quite unique. And this is tied to the locale of the intellectual, which is he had a certain respect for his interlocutors in a way similar to, say, even Christopher Hitchens. Hitchens, to his credit, was a man who believed in public deliberation and careful debate, surgical debate, right? Usually over great amounts of alcohol, and putting aside all of his positions and the kind of the way that they haven't aged well and so on, there is a way in which, and this might be something you agree with or not, we still try to, perhaps in this podcast space, at least model that bygone form of intellectual exchange, knowing full well that we're not pretending to be something more than we are. But I do think that there might be a bit of that in terms of what drives us to do these programs. So that's sort of a side point I wanted to make. But I think more to the line that you had just developed, I have the sense that the academization of being a critic, and here we really got to talk about Andrea Long Chu and her work, and I think we can focus on that in a moment. it creates a crisis of authority, though, in the sense that what we have to ask ourselves, sort of, what is the function of the critic, of the critical intellectual? Because there's a lot of different definitions of what that function might be. There's a Marxist definition, there's a liberal definition, right? And maybe even others. I have my own view on this ideal, on this type, on what the critic should be, right, et cetera, et cetera. So we also sort of need to answer that question. What actually is a critic, right? Because some would contend that we don't inhabit a public discourse that permits critical intellectuals to actually flourish today.
I mean, there's two incentives there, and then we can get into like some of Chu's key points in on authority. I actually will also occasionally reference Kojève and Strauss, because those two books, the Notion of Authority and On Tyranny, are actually really in the background of Chu's work. Even though she's writing about something completely different, she's not writing about the establishment of world government over time.
And she makes no citations, which I found interesting.
Right.
For a sophisticated article, which was part of the reason she won the Pulitzer Prize. A surprising poverty of citations.
I mean, I was sort of like, oh, you're going to mention the authoritarian personality and not even cite the original work and the problems with it. But anyway, but...
Oh, I know. There's so many things, and the presentation of Kant itself is kind of like, wait a second, because that is my own academic anxieties emerging when I read a summary of a philosopher without any citation. It does leave me a little uneasy, but it's fine. At the same time, I think I can get it. I do think that one needs a distance from the university to unlearn these anxious codes that a university has imposed on us. And Chu makes a good point that a lot of that anxiety is owed to the rise of French theory itself. Mm-hmm. And that moment in really from like late 60s all the way up to the late 90s and spilled over into 2000s, it changed the whole face of criticism in the West. We can talk about that as well.
I mean, we definitely can. I mean, I'm sort of obsessed with how not just Marxism, but a lot of theories go through the Sorbonne and get academicized, but also rock starized. Because you know, France does have academic rock stars, and I often hear that as something laudable about French culture. But I'm like, doesn't that in some ways actually remove your ability to critically engage with these people if they are figures of basically allegiance and entertainment, like a subcultural milieu? And I definitely see that with theorists, particularly actually with non-academics, who, however, justify a lot of their legitimacy by being able to prove that they can police the discourse around particular thinkers. And famously, it's what we all do in fucking Marxism. But if you think about like Deleuzian discourse or Nietzschean discourse or whatever, there are a group
Lacan,
Lacan, there are a group of people, some of whom are academics, often they're not in the field at hand. Many of whom are students of academics who did not become academics but are now out in the world, who make this their hobby. Now, I find that interesting because on one hand, there's a disavowal of authority in a lot of this work, but there's also a mimicking of the authority of the tenure room. that permeates society. There is a way in which, for example, when we talk about like wokeness, a problem that might be fading, but where it comes from in my mind, I always thought about where I encountered it. You know, we talked about the academic wars. You know, the before it was wokeness, it was call out culture. Before it's call out culture, it was politically correctness. Often, at first, the first critiques of these things actually come from elements of the left. The first critique of political correctness was not from right wingers; it was appropriated by them. Same with call out culture. Definitely with wokeness. But what's at stake here? If we actually look at what we mean by these terms, we mean activist circles of people who may or may not be educated. The idea that these are all educated PMC is wrong, but their instincts come from the inculcation in the public that the discourse that you get from universities is actually the primary way in which you show intellectual legitimacy. And that is in lieu of other forms of authority. And I think she was right about that by abandoning all authority and pretending that it's all arbitrary, we actually miss that we are actually giving in to unstated authorities. And we can talk about, you know, you might talk about the tyranny of structurelessness, but you might talk about the authoritarianism of non-authority. Because you have to police the discourse to make the discourse comprehensible if no one can master it. But that initial impulse and the way in which that discourse is policed on the left in particular, actually, on the right it's policed vulgarly, if you've ever spent a lot of time over there. But on the left, it's policed even by non-academics in the way you police the tenure room, which is what terms can you say? Who can you cite and not cite? What relationships are okay and what has to stay hidden? And you know, in that way, Chu to me speaks directly to what Sennet and Jacoby are talking about. In so much that there's both a material, like literally a structural reproduction going on. Who has the capacity to publish? Why are they publishing in this way? Why is there an industry that can produce this for the general public, et cetera, et cetera. And we think about like what a best-selling book is. You and I just mentioned it's about 5,000 copies, right?
Right.
That's not what a best-selling book was in the 60s.
Right. True.
You know, it was an order of magnitude larger than that.
Much larger. Right.
And you know, when I think about how many people read Jacoby, or we've talked about Christopher Lasch, like, or you know, these were not easy. They weren't written in jargon, actually, so much so that some of Lasch is difficult because he's implying jargon and not using it. But or he's using things that have common definitions in very jargony ways, but that is not obvious to you. Like there's a big difference between, like, say, what Christopher Lasch and Richard Sennet are on about when they talk about narcissism versus what Tom Wolfe was on about. Like Tom Wolfe just means the colloquial meaning of concerned with yourself. Lasch is very, very specifically in a, you know, early Orthodox Freudian milieu, but you can miss that until you read the book where he explains it.
Yeah, true.
But I think about this a lot. Like, there's some stuff in Chu's here. And
let me say one thing about the tyranny of, what did you call it? The tyranny of structuralness?
Tyranny of structuralistness, yeah.
Structuralistness, yeah. It's a I'm not sure if that's your phrase originally. I've heard it before.
It's not.
It's a wonderful phrase. It's an interesting dynamic, though, because if you analyze the meaning of that, to me, what it suggests is a compensation for the lack of a kind of resolute or stable forms of social authority, and then thereby the thinker, the philosopher, fills in that absent center that's not present, and they then do a lot of work for you. They do work in worldview building. They provide you a morality. They provide, even in a Kantian sense, the conception of what's a valid judgment of aesthetics and what's not. So they do the in fact, it's actually anti-Kantian in point of fact, if we look at what is enlightenment, because the claim is not that Kant would put forward this idea that the liberal intellectual would possess this kind of ultra power over helping you. No, if anything, it's a self act of emancipation to move out of self-imposed immaturity. I think it's an interesting point, though. I think psychoanalytically, it's, of course, just for folks that want to know the ABCs of psychoanalysis, it's what is called the transference. And I think that's the term of that's very useful to invoke here. I will say one thing. I don't want to discard it and to say it's infantile. No, I would say it's a constitutive or even a necessary part of any pedagogy. Sometimes it's cringe. Most of the time it's cringe. But unfortunately, it's a necessary part of the cycle. It's a necessary part of the stage of learning. You inhabit the master's world. You have to parasitically escape that. You have to overcome that. Sometimes it takes longer, and you may have multiple masters at different points in your life. But I think the point is that independence from them is actually an arduous road, if we're honest. Perhaps that is an indication of the life of the mind itself, or the kind of calling of what intellectual life is about. And perhaps maybe at the end of the day, very few people experience the intensity of this transferential dynamic with a thinker and then overcome it. Or maybe not. I'm not sure, because you had invoked, was it your grandfather who was a bricklayer, right? Probably he was not of the sort that would have this type of relationship with an author. But I would suggest there is a minimal transference anytime you're moved by a piece of literature, by a piece of philosophy, by a piece of poetry. And I wanted to ask you what you thought about that. Because perhaps one of Richard Sennet's points is true, where he talks about the idea that today we've sort of lost that capacity in the turn inward and in the turn to what he calls intimacy. So the highest form of authority, it's sort of like a scandal to think of the transference. And in a certain way, it's kind of like that which is most taboo for us, even though it still happens. So it becomes almost like hyper, or becomes exaggerated in our time because of these wider dynamics happening in our culture, the collapse of the public, etc. What do you make of that? What do you make of that, both for yourself as somebody that's read a lot of philosophy, but also perhaps how does that work in poetry? How does that work in poetry? Like, Harold Bloom has this idea of the anxiety of influence. Very important concept, which is the source of creativity. So again, the transference in psychoanalysis is established when you have kind of identified with your analyst and in such a deep way that it actually is creating a type of barrier for you, kind of agitation, even an aggressiveness that you then have to overcome, right? So that transferential relationship is overloaded with affect and emotion. It's extremely common. And for anyone that's ever been a teacher, it's the magic of teaching. And this is, of course, in Socrates' dialogues, the heart of what Socrates was trying to help his students overcome as well, which is not to fetishize me, not to fetishize the master, right? If anything, if the master loves being the object of that affect, he's not a good master, or she's not a good master, in a certain way. You want to help people get out of that entanglement. So it's a temporary entanglement, but it's a necessary and constitutive one. What do you make of it?
Well, from the standpoint of pedagogy, I tend to think of this in terms of mimesis, feedback, and then what we might call critical hostility. Like, if I think about the authors that I was first moved by, you go through series of them. There's almost some that in poetry, it's totally acceptable to be super into Allen Ginsberg and maybe even The Doors if you are a teenager in the 90s. But if you are saying that at 25, they consider you immature. Bukowski is another one where it's super acceptable to be influenced by him when you're very young. And weirdly, once you've gone through a cycle of maturity, and then like don't try to mimic him anymore. Now, I mean, we could talk about like some of this transference that you see, and a critic's role in this transference is to problematize the fandom to the point that you can start working between the flaws, or between the elisions, or between what you cannot replicate yourself, or what was contextually just not relevant to you, as you develop your own work. Like, for me, if you take a thinker and just try to replicate them, one, and this is true in poetry too, one, it's not possible. You cannot replicate their exact epistemology unless they're your contemporary. And then why would you want to? So there's always going to be a sort of friction, even in the most faithful tutelage to a thinker or a writer or a kind of poetry, as you shift from that context to yours. Now, what I find interesting, I mean, there's a lot of stuff in Chu about American Psycho and this, that, and the other. But there's also a lot of stuff in her that's really kind of about pedagogy and feminist politics, and the kinds of things that would have gotten you a Pulitzer in the late aughts. Probably wouldn't so much now, actually. But there's also some key insights about all this delegitimization of kinds of authority that is a kind of problem for critic. All right. So if I am a poet, all right. Now, as a poet, I start out basically almost in like a classical, very basic, the part of psychoanalysis, even most contemporary psychologists would agree with you, mirror stage way. Then we increase feedback. I respond to feedback. And then I start buckling under the weight of that feedback and wanting to do my own thing. One of the problems that you have in a lot of pedagogy today is there's this assertion of authority and also this denial of it. So the assertion of the authority of the group, the emotive responses of the group are varied. Like, ask someone to define what social justice is, and you'll really see this. Like, you're just like, they can't define it in a way that's not, circular to the emotive responses of the people who believe like this is a human right. And all I have to say is like, why? And usually I get some kind of hybrid answer of deontology and utilitarianism, but neither of which actually makes sense for human rights. But this also removes the idea that social friction between the group itself is necessary, and that transference requires both hierarchy and its disavowal. So in a way, like trying to start off from the completely egalitarian, I'm the teacher and I'm the student and we know the exact same thing. Like idea. I'm the critic and you're the interested reader and we know the exact same thing.
Right.
What does that lead to?
Right.
It leads to, I can't make transference. I'm just going to get stuck in a phase of mimesis so that I can stay within the grouping. Particularly if that's grouping's instincts are not cultivated by some kind of practical endeavor where you have measurable results, but a maintenance of a social milieu.
Yeah.
And one of the weird things about the academicization of public intellectuals is so much of it then devolves into fandoms, because how do we negotiate between opinions if the only thing that can separate the opinions is credentialization? There's no standard for which I could judge your authority versus mine. And that's a problem.
It's a problem. It's a very good point, because if you take philosophy, it's not adequate to say that what differentiates me from, I don't know, somebody with different credentials or an AI machine is my experience. Because if I maintain that, I've reproduced the same relativistic perspectivism that is at the heart of the crisis of authority of intellectual life itself. So one must combine, I think, a foothold in the technical craft, in training, etc., in a lineage of thought that one has ascended, has worked through, has struggled with some foothold in life, in the category of life. And I've always sought to do that. The students in my classes, especially when I teach at the working class colleges, that I like the most are the ones who are the most unimpressed with me. Because I try to comport myself, because of course in my unconscious I'm desiring for my students to form a transference with me. But when I find those ones that are hostile to me, they get inside of my head and they direct me in a way that's better, away from that, which is a bad impulse as a teacher. To want to be revered is, I think, is not what you should do as an educator. I'll never forget, I once was teaching a course and one of my students said to me, I cannot take this class anymore because it's not that I don't like the material. It's that I've decided I'm not ready to absorb, or I cannot integrate what you're trying to teach me at this point in my life. In other words, he thought the material was too heavy for him. It was like an emotional labor that he wasn't ready to bring on to himself. And I thought to myself, I actually respect this to some extent. This is interesting, because there is that interesting dynamic that a lot of young people face today, which is tied into what we've talked about in past conversations of, the legal structure at American academic institutions of what's called in loco parentis, in the place of the parents. These are these laws that were introduced in the 1950s at the University of California system and now have become ubiquitous. And what they basically refer to is this idea that the bureaucracy of the university is responsible for the maintenance of the personal and emotional life of each student. And this is where you get things like safe space and all of that. It's a legal construct, right? It's a highly paternalistic logic, and I criticize it in my writing heavily, but I don't criticize it in some vulgar right-wing way, like, wake up snowflake or toughen up snowflake. No, it's a structural legal mechanism that is actually harming the crisis of authority in a certain way. So, that dynamic is difficult, but at the same time, I think that you're right to point out that students are pushing against this in a spontaneous way. Like there's a kind of, and this kind of dovetails to Wallerstein's very interesting article about spontaneity of students, right? Where he basically says that students have a spontaneous direction to upset liberal centrism, and that this is actually a good thing when it is not taken to excesses, right? Which I found to be an interesting kind of defense of May 68 in a certain way. But then Wallerstein says, yeah, well, those impulses basically no longer have the same power that they used to in a certain way. So all of that's to say that, yes, the crisis of intellectual authority is very interesting. I mean, in a way, it's hard to make heads or tails of it. What I sort of disagree with Chu is this idea that we're having a crisis of skill. I disagree with that in the sense that I think we're having less a crisis of like skilled or talented critics, as much as we're having a crisis of a highly rigidified class-based exclusionary system that's not capable of fully having the resources to generate talents that's already latent and present. And keep in mind, Chu's class and dynamic is interesting, is that part of Chu's biography, of course, is that she emerges from the generation, I think that to paraphrase, of the lost PhD generation, which had no teaching prospects. She was a student of Avital Ronell at NYU, I think in philosophy, right? But had no formal place in the university. Now, my view is that obviously Chu has gone on to do something much better than a tenure track philosophy job, frankly. This is exactly, to me, it's beautiful, right? To me, that's what this system should be producing, where we kind of convert or sublimate the crisis, not into some kind of pessimistic wallowing despair, but into something like, no, actually, Chu became a critic who won a Pulitzer for writing an essay without any footnote, summarizing very complex ideas, whatever, in the New Yorker, and had hundreds of thousands of readers, right? That's quite interesting, Of course, I don't agree with everything Chu says, but the function that Chu plays is super vital, I'd like to see many more Chus, So, but I got the impression there's a slight elitism in Chu, and even she quotes Ryan Ruby at the end, where they say, oh, yeah, like, they almost get quasi-Nietzschean, where it's like, oh, yeah, very few excellent critics today. I don't know if I see it that way. I don't know how you slice that, but that's my view.
I mean, I find her epilogue very paradoxical and not necessarily in a good way. And I'll just read a section of it.
Please.
So if all the critic does is provide food for thought, I say, let thought starve. The only criticism worth doing for my money is not the kind that claims to improve society in general. It is, as the late John Berger once wrote, the kind that helps destroy this particular one. To be clear, I do not wish to overvalue the business. I have no illusions about the political value of a staff writer at a print magazine owned by a corporation. I do not think it is much, though I am not foolish enough to suppose that it is nothing. But I do believe that criticism at its best can be a small act of freedom. Now, this reminds me of Adorno's resignation, but I'll come back to that. Not, I should say, freedom of thought as the liberal understands it. That is, freedom to entertain every idea and commit to none. That is not true freedom. It is merely license, and always depends upon the approval of some authority. Coleridge imaged of criticism as a windmill, grinding every person's grist into the same indifferent flour, was a better metaphor than he knew, for someone owned the mill. When the good critic urges us to form our political beliefs that we might contemplate a work of art that is from a safe distance, he is casting himself as Sancho Panza, the faithful squire. In truth, he is worried that in charging the rim mill, he will discover that it was really a giant all along. This is why we cling to authority. It guarantees our freedom while relieving us of the burden of exercising it, turning it into something fine and handsome and altogether useless, like an old suit of armor. What, after all, was Don Quixote's great delusion? Cervantes tells us. To put into practice everything that he had read. We know the man of La Mancha was a terrible critic. He used to stay up all night torturing meaning out of trashy romances. But in one respect, he was absolutely right. He refused to believe that the things he read about existed in a different world than the one he already lived in. This strikes us as the behavior of a madman, tells you how impoverished our concept of intellectual freedom remains today. We want reading to free the mind. We do not want it to free the reader. And for my part, I am with old Hidalgo. When he rolled full tilt at the giant in the skies, he was acting on the correct assumption that reading was not enough. That, it seems to me, the only way to do without authority, to go out and do it. Now, I find that interesting because at a fundamental level, what Cervantes is describing in Don Quixote is a man who is trying to be an authority by living as if the world is the way he wants it to be. That is not actually a buckling of authority, as a reproduction of it. Because where does your notion of what the good world is comes from? And while, I was with you when I was reading that, I'm like, oh, you almost sound Marxist for the first half of that statement. But then the second half, for all like, oh, I'm not a liberal, it actually recapitulates a lot of liberal ideas by castigating them. And I find that very interesting about her uncomfortableness with authority in and of itself. That authority is the want to be commanded, or the want to remove, or the want to abstractify. But honestly, even when I look at what Chu responded to literature, right, what she castigated in terms of literature, it's exactly what I would predict someone in her situation at a magazine from her background would say. Bret Easton Ellis is a dick. Octavia Butler is cool. Maggie Nelson has opinions. To that, I actually do want to say, nothing in this book changed any of my world. So what?
Mm. Mm.
And that is not to say that I don't think there shouldn't be a million Chus. We are, in some ways, very similar people. We're overproduced academics. I have a terminal degree. It's not a doctorate, but I have one. I work tangentially to universities, but it's not how I make my living. It never has been. Well, except I take that back. It was how I made my living for about 3 years. I try to write. We're writing together. We can talk about like me and writing, because I'm often tasked with writing, and I find that I often don't have time for it. Because of the nature of all the things I do. I have to make special time for it and really concentrate for it, which I will admit does not allow you to specialize in the way that a lot of people who would want to become intellectuals would want to do. Working at a magazine does give you that ability. It really does.
Yeah. No, yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Final point.
No. I like that she's aware of that. Like that she does not bracket that out. Yeah. But I don't think she actually gets out of the problem she's castigating liberal intellectuals for doing. particularly because she's not driving what she's engaging with. She's engaging with what you have to engage with in a particular milieu, because that's the milieu you're in.
So many fine points. I think the invocation of Kant's definition of the critic forms the kind of backbone of where Chu does have a kind of conservative liberal position in the piece, insofar as the appeal to this kind of postmodern collapse of the public, you know, this idea that in reality we're in a world in which our authority is gauged by the intimate relationality of our interior lives, and that she says very nicely to illustrate this point that the task of the critic is to be a figure who confirms a shared reality with the reader, which makes sense. In other words, when I read something, the basis by which I desire to read it and I get pleasure out of reading it is that they confirm a worldview or a perspective on the world that resonates with me, that I find some solace in. Now, that's a perspectivism that's quite pernicious. You could call this in Sennet, and I totally agree with you. And Jacoby, I don't know if you noticed this, but Jacoby chastises Sennet's fall of public man as the opposite of what the New York intellectuals were capable of doing in their genius capacity to translate dense philosophical and theoretical concepts into something more accessible for a general public. Because the reason I assigned, you know, Sennet's The Fall of Public Man from 1977 is because it's a book which is trying to systematize decades and decades of sociological and philosophical research, right? Highly interdisciplinary, but synthesize it for a public in a vernacular that's so common, that's so like folkish, that Jacoby says, yeah, you've taken all the substance out. You've gone too far. You've gone too far. And, you know, you've gone too far. So that's kind of the interesting point, is that the critic is a master when they can find that median point between not over academicizing your writing and maintaining the authority that is capable of communicating to a literate audience. Okay. And that is the Kantian achievement of the moral, of that kind of capacity. Now, if you go back and you study, you know, Kant's famous essay on the meaning of criticism from what is enlightenment, there does exist, and it's very interesting that Chu, by the way, ends with this homage to Napoleon, right? Because the precondition of authority is actually found in what Kant calls, ideally, the benevolent despot. Right? The benevolent despot does make possible the circulation of universal utterances in a, you know, sort of field of belles lettres in a certain way. And so, in a sense, what the critic is meant to do is, as I mentioned before, function kind of as the figure that can orientate one's own, and this the key watchword for Kant is, of course, indifference to aesthetic tastes of beauty, right? So there's this kind of idea of there's a certain idea of perfection that is there that's quite interesting. But I have the feeling that Chu's reading of Kant, which is not my reading of Kant, it's not my reading of Kant in the sense it's a very conservative reading of Kant, does want to say to the liberal establishment that you have forgotten your duty, which is to cultivate critics that do possess the authority, that would be capable of elevating to, you know, something like a kind of a critic for whom the public could valorize and could, you know, but this is so interesting because if we think about what it means in today's public sphere to valorize and celebrate a public intellectual, I would contend that there has not been a moment in recent history where that is more impossible than today. In the sense that the mechanisms of consensus, and what's interesting, by the way, is Harold Bloom. You know what Harold Bloom called French theory? He called it the discourse on resentment.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Well, precisely in the way that it sought at the origin of all discourse, it had this obsession with power, such that the great Emersonian version of the critic, or even the Whitman version of the critic, was foreclosed, was totally foreclosed, and you enter into this hyper politicization of the critic, right? Which, of course, Bloom wanted to avoid. One of the interesting things that Chu says, and I want your take on this, is that era of French theory is now dead, in part because, and this is my interpretation, and I kind of agree with her here, it has led to the hyper politicization of everything, including the field of experience. So, yes, we have the crisis of authority. Yes, it's all this interior perspectival maze. But even within that maze, it's still like perceived as political, right? Or rather, we engage with political figures and political discourse in the same way that we have this confirmation bias relationship I mentioned before, right? It still functions that way. When we have a transference with Zoran or with Obama or with Bernie, etc. So now she says the new horizon of criticism is a kind of return to Belles Lettres, is a return to more basic literary forms. What do you think about that? That may be interesting. I'm not sure if that's something that is necessarily because I don't think that French theory was a Marxist movement, right?
No.
So I do feel the poverty, or rather the absence of a kind of like, what would the Marxist critic have to say about this? I mean, I think first of all, we would have to go back and reinterpret Kant to begin with, because Kant's whole foundation is not based upon this. One can interpret Kant as not reliant on this particular form of state authority. So that's my first point, precisely. But I don't want to get into the details on that. But so I don't know. Like I feel that that's a bit missing. Yeah. But what do you make of that?
I mean, in so much that French theory, ironically, often slavishly reproduced by people, was about overcoming a discourse of academic authority. Its very replication has always been based on an academic authority. Going down to and including its initial reception and John Hopkins, all the way back when Derrida first came into the States. And ironically, it's actually very similar to the critique of reason that you see in Foucault and in Derrida, which itself has the problematic function of replicating the reasoning of which it is critiquing, replicating the psychoanalytic structuralism of which it is critiquing to undo itself. And once you have undone it, you are left in free fall. And for many people, always interpret me saying this as a very conservative point, but I actually do not think so, because what you are asserting there is that what makes theory theory is that a theorist said it, right? Now, actually do think if we want to talk about a specific section in Chu's book, where this comes up most clearly, it's her critique of Maggie Nelson.
Mm.
Okay. This is about the rhetoric of harm, but we can tie it back in a second, because this is also a place where she mentions a lot of theory and theory's role. The rhetoric of harm goes something like this. Depicting harm through art can be harmful to marginalized people, and artists who refuse to be held accountable for that harm end up furthering it, regardless of their views on the matter. Nelson doesn't like this line of thinking. She worries it places undue restraints on the artist's freedom to give expression to complex, sometimes disturbing dimensions of their psyches, that it is a hair-triggered condemnations eclipse the slow work of looking, making, reading, thinking, and that it reflects the homogenizing logic of paranoia that divides art into good and bad, right and wrong. If Nelson's argument sounds like you've heard it before, or perhaps you made it yourself, it's because it is. I regret that Nelson prosecutes his argument with a level of care unbecoming of the genre, which is ironically to be found all over the very internet, whose deleterious effects the author likes to decry. But why should we listen to yet another emissary of Generation X complain about a world drunk on scapegoating, virtue signaling, and public humiliation? It doesn't matter anymore whether the complaints like this are legitimate. Maybe they are, but they are also boring. Now, I hate to tell you, but as a critique of perspectivism, that is, of the kind of what you see emerging out of theory, it degrades to pure theory. Like, no, I'm not super sympathetic to everything Maggie Nelson says, but this isn't really to me, this is not a serious argument. I'll continue. It doesn't help that Nelson's two main examples, to which he frequently returns in Art Song, are both from 2017. Sam Durant's sculpture Scaffold at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, a life-scale replica of gallows used to hang 38 Dakota men that were eventually removed following protests and negotiations between the museum and the Dakota elders, and Dana Schultz's open casket, a sort of abstract oil painting of Emmett Till, exhibited at the Whitney Biennial in New York, that became the object of national controversy when the artist Hannah Black demanded in an open letter posted on Facebook that painting be removed and destroyed. Scandals in the art world brown like bitten apples. To discuss them now, as relevant as they may be to the point at hand, feels like an unsolicited rehashing. If there's one thing everyone should be able to agree about that letter now, is that people should talk about it then. Well, but fine, let's talk about it. Nielsen criticized protesters for applying the language of physical harm, for instance, a slap in the face, as a person describes Durant's installation. It's one thing, Nielsen says, to argue that neo-Nazis chanting slogans through the streets were engaged in violence. But to say that an oil painting by Schultz, a white woman, perpetrated violence against Black communities, as some protesters put it, or that Durant's installation reinstated the violent power of serenity, as a scholar, Arne de Beauvoir, wrote, Nielsen sees an insidious logic at work here, as if all art could have power analogous to a militarized state. I agree that violence is a difficult word these days. It means too much and rarely enough. But watch what Nelson says next. When protesters and academics equate work of art with violence, she says, their arguments mirror a classical prerequisite not only for censorship, but also for the persecution of artists. Nelson's example is the artist and porn star Annie Sprinkle, who was once jailed on charges of sodomy after making a zine depicting a penetration by an amputee's stump. This is a surprising comparison when a scholar like de Beauvoir claims, an academic monograph with a likely print run of a few thousand, that Durant's gallows reinstated state violence against Dakota Nation. Should readers consider this speech act on par with a sex worker's literal detention by the police, simply because it pays into the same argument historically used to persecute artists? Equating art with violence is bad, but equating rhetoric with violence isn't. Who is calling the state now?
Interesting, yeah. I mean, one thought I had in listening to your critiques of Chu is that let's superimpose, for the sake of just an exercise, that we accept the terminal status of the perspectival narcissistic turn in the reading public. Let's just say that we accept that as a fait accompli.
Mm-hmm.
You said something that struck my interest, which is nothing that I read from Chu surprised me. And you said the reason for that was because it tended to be all based on the construction of opinions that would be from people of Chu's class background and habitus involved in these particular institutions
At this particular time between
at this
2016 and
particular time,
2021.
etc. Right. So if that's true, in a quite vulgar way, perhaps, that's an argument for something that Chu does not talk about, but which maybe does need to be talked about, which would be the creation of critics not from those class backgrounds. Because if this turn is, because I mean, I will be the first to admit I take this turn to be monstrous at face value. Meaning that I would like to construct a public exchange, which is not like I've always been skeptical about Lash's theory of narcissism, which is something we can talk about. Let's just put that to the side. But like, again, if it's true, well, where's the class dimension? Where's that? Why are we not talking about, the creation of public reading publics along those lines? Because there is a certain tyranny of the bourgeois perspective that's reproduced in this space without question, but the discourse of power that they bring to bear does not include a class lens at all, so they don't care about that, right? Maybe we should, or maybe the fact that it's absent is a reason why this literary public isn't catching off as much in a certain way, more broadly speaking, perhaps. So that's one point I wanted to make. I think the other point I wanted to make is the idea that what I do like about Chu, though, is the philosophical point that she's criticizing literary figures, including like Zadie Smith, and saying things like, actually, nothing you say is quite original because you're still caught in this paradigm of experience. And so for Chu, what's original is theory, is philosophy, is the development of concepts. And that's cool. And that's true that a lot of writers are not like that. That doesn't necessarily take away from their greatness, but they're not doing that. You know what I'm saying? They're not philosopher literary. That's very rare, perhaps, to have a figure like that, a literary figure that invents concepts, right? But that's what Chu wants. And I like that about Chu because I also want that, as a philosopher myself. That's also, so I kind of resonate with her on that level. And I also felt like the critique of Maggie Nelson is a bit disingenuous because in other places, Chu is criticizing places like the New York Times for being agnostic on trans issues. So, and also celebrating things like Scum Manifesto. So Chu has a certain hyper politics as well. But at the same time, Chu seems to criticize hyper liberal politics. It doesn't quite seem consistent to me. Like what is your theory of the proper intensity of liberal demands in politics? Do you know what I mean? Like I can't understand Chu's conservatism to the extent that she is. And I know that category is ambiguous. I mean, you and I both know that very well. Reading figures like McIntyre, Lash, Strauss, and others, there's a certain porosity, a certain undefinability there, which of course, well, I think actually it can be defined, but so there is, you called it paradoxical, but I think it's just kind of more ambiguous, where she's at, where actually is Chu coming at politically. At the same time, she's also hypercritical of any criticism of wokeism. And that too seems strange to me, because that seems reflective of a kind of general liberal view that the spontaneity, there's something like a spontaneous masses, and they're always right.
Right.
When you actually drill down to what they mean by that, often demographically they're kind of talking about like grad students as the masses, right? Or not grad students, but college kids,
college kids are people who represent groups such as like the elders of the Dakota Nation,
right?
Not what people on the res say, because those are not the same thing. If you've ever spent time with indigenous groups, you will be very shocked at the difference in politics between elders and academics and people who represent them. Even in the Marxist circles, quite frankly, and the actual politics, voting records, and concerns on the res. Conservatives will use this against you often the time, but the problem is they're not entirely wrong. So I mean, I found this as an eminent critique of liberalism. Like, I get being annoyed of comparing art, the criticism art to, persecution of artists, when you're also complaining about violence, because it's a double jump that Nelson is making that actually replicates the jump the theorists are making. I actually want to say that's a good point. But the thing is, I have my issue with wokeness is that it is a constantly shifting terrain that is actually very easy to undermine, precisely because of its vagueness, and precisely because people can say, well, you know what it is when you see it, on both sides of that debate. People say, oh, well, you know what wokeness is, or you don't know what wokeness is. I'm like, well, I know what the term meant when it was used by Black activists in the 60s. I know what the term meant in 2013 when it was appropriated on Twitter, and I know what right-wingers vaguely mean by it today, right? And those are all comprehensible. They're not the same thing. But what we're dealing with is the moral sensibilities of, I mean, on one hand, to put it another way, on one hand, these are written for the idea of an educated audience, the kind of thing that Jacoby would be talking about. On the other hand, I am clued into the art scene, and I did not know what the hell her and Nelson were fighting over until I looked it up. Like, who is paying attention to outcries about installments at New York art shows?
Right, which goes back to the conservative Kantian, I think, desire of Chu, which is that today that she and others become recognized centerpieces of great literary critics, such as we had. So there's a certain nostalgia for a return to that. So the more that she's talking about other big name critics and artists and literary figures as if they are peers, the more it feels like insider baseball, what you're reading, the more it feels like a celebrity tabloid, and the more the transference of the kind of unthinking narcissistic public, in theory, even though whatever, I don't like that term, would align with them. So now I'm not accusing her of doing that. That would be quite opportunistic. But again, why couldn't we think of our public with more dignity and self-independence than that? In a certain way, it's like, I feel that, yeah, there's a prodding of the liberal center. There's a prodding that's taking place of a kind of, you let me show you what radicalism is. You are insufficiently educated in it. You are afraid of it. I'm at the vanguard of it. This is what gives me authority. The problem with that is that is what gives you authority, right? You won the Pulitzer for within that terrain, and it's a very specific relationship. And those liberals will drop you when it's inconvenient.
Who knows? They may have already have.
They may already have. They will drop you when it's inconvenient. And then what? And then what? Right. So, but that's the thing. And like, I know that, I mean, I haven't studied this carefully, although I desire to, is the way that the liberal bourgeoisie constructs, the fetish, right? The empty fetish around, however we valorize or define genius, criticism, etc. Right.
I mean, we can think about this in a way about three other contemporary figures: Ta-Nehisi Coates, Robin DiAngelo, and Abraham X. Kendi. The latter two are only now taken seriously in a very narrow slice of liberal academia. Even most liberal academia does not consider them to be super important, even though they were trying to make their books universally required reading for freshmen as little as 3 years ago. Now, I point that out. We can critique, DiAngelo's HRness. We can critique X. Kendi's. I say something that shocks people. I like X. Kendi's first book, not his other two, but I actually think his stamp from the beginning, the history of racism, is useful. Do I agree with all its presumptions? Do I agree with how it tries to re-flatten out racism, make it clearer and making it not clear at all? Do I agree that his project, when actually implemented, like basically led to nothing but lost a lot of money? Yeah, but I actually think its first book is interesting. We don't talk about it anymore because, again, liberals seem embarrassed by the 2018 to 2022 moment. They were already tilting away from that under Biden. They're definitely tilting away from that under Trump 1. What I find interesting about Chu, because I want to defend Chu, I know I sound really negative, but Chu is doing effectively an eminent critique of liberal values that points out the hazy contradictions in those values, but cannot transcend them. Right. Because it still has to reaffirm the unstated biases of the larger cultural milieu of which Chu is operating in, even while critiquing Gen X writers who do certain things about art. Like,
absolutely true. Yes. And it seems that in a very specific sense, October 7th was a watershed moment for the contingent from which Chu hails, of kind of people permitted to come on the inside of the bourgeois literary scene for a period of time. Like, we will allow you to pester us and prod us and pry us and harass us, right? October 7th stopped that.
Yep, that's why I mentioned Coates. That's what the Coates...
And Coates too. Although he comes from obviously a different vector, but a similar, right, but a similar function.
Like, Coates actually both became relevant again and also got turned on by the very people who made him relevant in the first place by his stances after October 7th, 2023.
And the thing with Marxists is that we're just not allowed into that world. They just won't. That's not, like, you know what I mean? Like, we're not. No. Now historically, we
were, but we're not now.
Historically, there was a series of that's right. I mean, the long story short is we were, but not now. And we can go back to, I think, many examples of preeminent Marxist thinkers. But the way that functioned, by the way, was more along the lines of Marxism as a dominant discourse, largely having to do with Cold War, security, state concerns, etc. But how that affected intellectual life was interesting, because our critics were far more skilled in actually reading Marxist material than they are now.
Both liberals and reactionaries, like you read Gomez de Villa, or you read Arthur Schlesinger, they actually know what they're talking about Marxism. Whereas I feel like today you read stuff is like you're just making that shit up.
Yeah,
Like,
that dynamic, but you also had the dynamic of people coming affected by revolutionary sequences. Former Marxists turned liberal in the case of Kolakowski. In the case of the New York intellectuals, it's half of them are Trotskyists turned neocon, right? So there's a lot of shifts and movements, right? There's a lot of shifts. For them, the big event was not October 7th. You know, the big event was for that generation, it was the 67 war.
right.
Also Israel Palestine. And that actually had a different effect than it does now in an interesting way. You know what that event did is it turned a lot of those Marxists to the right. What I'm finding now,
Even on the black tradition with people like Harry Kuruz, I mean, like, because they looked at they looked at Marxist ambivalence and support initially of Israel, and like, oh well, you didn't do that for African causes, we should be cultural nationalists now, et cetera, et cetera. So I mean, I know people don't think of that as right wing, and yet, I mean, it moved a lot of black radicals out of engaging with popular culture and into engaging with themselves. But go ahead.
Oh well, yeah, and that's the yeah. In a sense, what's the 67 war is it was a kind of an initial move to the right, which then became by the time of the late 70s something was almost like a tidal wave with the neoliberal ascendancy. What I think we're seeing now in the face of October 7th is that short-lived period of time where we're seeing, October 7th, the rise of Trump 2. The liberal status quo is completely unsure about how to integrate left intelligentsia into its project. And the left intelligentsia has not turned to the right, but they have become quietistic. They do not have a kind of viable platform in which their project reaches a public. And I think this is also compounded by the pandemic. So a lot of these figures, I think even including Chu, are kind of in a kind of ascetic retreat from the public, I would claim. Right?
I mean, I think about the menu around M+1, the milieu around
Right.
M+1. Like, I don't see them anymore, really.
Exactly. Or even, Commune magazine, there's a few public figures, but there is a sense increasingly that, Richard Sennet's notion of the total evacuation of the public is certainly very felt, very real, very, very palpable in a certain way. Perhaps we could prognosticate about what the regeneration of bourgeoisie would look like in terms of reintegrating something. Of course, the dynamics of social democracy, resurgent, and Mamdani have to be fit into this.
I mean, I think left populism is what they're doing. But but even that, I mean, this is what I find very fascinating. If you do Bill de Blasio's program and even use the rhetoric of social democracy, you see liberals polarize around it in a way that they did not priorly do. And in some ways, people can interpret that as, oh, we're more dangerous than we were in the past. But in another way, we're more wedded to the Democratic Party than ever. I can tell you just today, a working class candidate wanted me to help them get signatures. And you know what they asked me to do? Donate money through Act Blue. Real working class candidate, by the way. Like DSA cadre person. Still completely tied up in the larger apparatus of the Democratic Party. And with very little obvious way in which the local Democratic Party is going to support them at all.
Right.
And I bring this up because as a public intellectual, if you read Lionel Trilling, for example, or some of these people, some of them were formal Marxists, some of them were just Marxist adjacent. They hung out with us, like,
like Edmund Wilson, for example,
right.
Who's most famous American critic of all time.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of my first exposures to Lenin was through Finland Station. But anyway,
yeah.
when I was writing, I was like 18. The way in which Marxism was used, even and was used even during the period of French theory, as a valid critical apparatus, but not a valid politics. I mean, I was taught Marxist literary criticism, which to me, as you know, an active Marxist, seems to be almost an insane thing. Like, yes, such a thing exists. Lukács and Christopher Caldwell and Adorno and so did it, but that is such a minor part of experience to be absurd.
This actually is a very nice point that Immanuel Wallerstein hits on in his piece, which is that the New Left and a lot of this had a Marxist flavor. 1844 manuscripts are translated in the 1950s in English by Johnson Forrest Tendency for the first time. And personal liberation becomes the watchword of revolution. Now, Wallerstein says, I think, a nice point, which was that the student movement that centered personal liberation had an undergirding motivation to do so, to avoid embourgeoisement. Now, what I find interesting in more contemporary discourses, like these kind of leftists that are allowed in, quote unquote, is that it may be a sign of how repressive and constrictive the bourgeois literary establishment is today. But don't you notice that so little is said in literary critique about a project of personal liberation? Like, in other words, there's all kinds of ways that the 60s still infuses our politics in really regressive and infantile ways. But at the same time, I think Mark Fisher did have a point in his Acid Communism piece, where he's like, actually, there's elements of the 60s that we truly have lost touch with, right? And I think this might be one of them, And this also goes back to the total evacuation of class, not class consciousness, but just basic class frameworks of viewing social reality. When that's gone, we're not even thinking personal liberation as an escape from the pressures of class. And therefore, we're not even capable of really thinking what personal liberation is.
No, it just becomes a consumer choice.
Yeah. So, like, in that sense, the Frankfurt School become prophets. They're, oh my God, wait a second. They were right. Oh shit. What do we do now? But like, they don't have to be. That's my point. It's actually like there can be the construction of a critical, series of projects in which personal liberation is brought back onto the table through class lens and a more robust way. Wouldn't you agree? Or do you think that that's not viable? I mean, that's a real question that I would have, I know the bourgeoisie is not necessarily going to allow it that way, but there has to be other means and mechanisms to pursue it.
Well, I think, one of the advantages of the Jacoby book above the other two that we talk about is it does actually root these things in material reproduction in a way that Sennet only kind of does and Chu doesn't. And I was thinking about this because I've been thinking a lot about Gramsci and, not hegemony as like, oh, bourgeois society is controlling us through its hegemonic apparatuses, but hegemony as a way to build proletarian self-awareness and culture, the way to bring about the organic intellectual as a bridge between, say, the party diktats and party pedagogues like Kotsky, who were often, really were vulgar, and sometimes they weren't. You know, Kautsky's one of the most adroit Marxist thinkers sometimes, and other times you read him and you're just like, wow, that's something else. But when I think about that today, I mean, personal liberation involving, you know, your abolition of your class position of which you are self-emancipated through a collective project that meant that you could be an agent both as an individual who has individual agency but has no real play in the aggregate forces of history. Most of us, the great billions at this point, and thus as a class having the ability to start organizing in a way to have agentic force as a subject of history. I think that this is both a pedagogical and a self-expressive thing. We are both teaching people how to do that and discovering it ourselves simultaneously. And that does have to be enacted. And that sounds a little bit like what Chu's talking about at the end of her book, but that does come from a position of awareness that does have to regard a tradition that does deal with methods and stuff, and methods in particular, but also political, scientific, and even pedagogical and artistic programs as given and disciplining, so that liberation is achievable. And that last part was what was both radical to the New Left about Marxism, but what was also recuperable about Marxists as kind of the loyal, to use a Thorburn quote, Marxism was the loyal opposition to modernity.
Yeah.
That we were opposing bourgeois intellectuals, but we also wanted to liberate them from their own bullshit, and acknowledging what violent bullshit it often was, and how over time it seems to completely regress back to pre-bourgeois forms to maintain itself, to maintain property and power, and only leave liberalism as a hollowed out atomization. And that can seem like a cultural critique. The Althusserians will accuse me of being a culturalist and not understanding structures, but I actually think it's a structural critique, because I can even explain it in terms of changing the workforce, the centralization of technology, and the lumpinization, atomization of parts of the proletariat, the way in which stratas of the working class and the petite bourgeoisie intersect in ways that give them a kind of labor aristocratic privilege, and yet, because they cannot question anything from a class position and the authority of breaking down these structures, they end up getting stuck in the emergent role of the critic, but we can't question the cultural roles and what their reinforcements really are. Like when you and I don't consider myself anti-woke. I think people will often read this sometimes as wokeness, or they'll read this as anti-wokeness. For me, I consider the whole question to be something that as a Marxist I should be beyond. The questions of social reproduction and gender are something that I have to look at objectively and socially. And I do find a lot of the things about woke discourse is they replicate the atomization of individuals, while also pretending, and I do think it's pretending, to be about structures. Now, we are beyond the facile critiques of privilege that I could have done. In fact, I did 10 years ago, even. I don't think we're in that world anymore in a lot of ways. But we have to ask ourselves, what are we left with then? Marxists aren't even used as the loyal opposition anymore. We are either something to be appropriated in left populism or cast out in most centrist liberalism. At the very moment, when we talk about public intellectuals, where the public intellectuals have nothing to say. Where is today, right now, where is the non-emotive, coherent, thought out analysis of Trumpism? There are attempts at it, but it barely exists. Where are all the like ultra left and left academics of a few years ago? They vacated the premises. So what are we stuck talking about? Well, we're talking about stuff that happened in the 50s and 60s, the appropriation by the intelligence services, but also the liberal conscience of Marxism, about how we do or don't feel about political questions that, frankly, were solved by the gun forces of history a long time ago. I don't think those are unimportant questions. I actually want to make that clear. I don't want to castigate people for discussing them. But that's what we have right now.
Yeah.
So even as Marxists, our public intellectual duty, are we doing it? I don't know. I think we have played a role, a very viable role, and a very serious role in getting people to think both about class and about imperialism and the relationship and tensions between the two. And even liberals have picked up on that. But what did they do with it? It was used for a kind of quietistic politics. I remember certain liberals after October 7th making comments like, well, the indigenous people came for me, I would just lay down or I would hide, but I wouldn't do anything. And I'm like, they're not coming for you because they understand numbers. This is an imagination that you're having out of your own guilt. This is not a Marxist response to things. The Marxist response is like, how do we empower those people and empower ourselves also? Because that's what solidarity is. But the public intellectual tradition, I feel, and I do think Jacoby is right about this, since the 40s. Now, we talked a lot about the intellectuals of the 50s and 60s, right? And the end of this public intellectual cycle. But I can't imagine us producing a Gramsci or, and for those who don't know, these people were not all working class backgrounds. They weren't. But they were not academics either. But we read them as if they were.
Yeah. I think, okay, so the construction of a Marxist intellectual with bona fides and rigor and excellence is typically, since, Frederick Jameson fulfilled that role, at least from the position of bourgeois authority for many decades, I would contend, in the United States. But he had to make a lot of sacrifices in his discourse regarding there were certain limits to that. And the locus of his power revolved around his academic positioning. So I think Jacoby's right to point to that as a structural limitation. What he advocates, and what I would also want to advocate, is a kind of democratization of intellectual production that is horizontally distributed beyond the rigid division of labor and its codifications according to liberal order, so that we see 1,000 flowers bloom in terms of people publishing their own work and creating a more vibrant, like that would be. And this is very much a kind of Republic of Letters sort of vision that I think is probably the only way that something like a viable public sphere could be reconstituted. What would it look like for Marxist and socialist ideals to be behind a new Republic of Letters? That's not impossible. I do think, though, that the ideological pressure involved with participation in the foundation world, the academic world, comes at a cost, which is very difficult to face, of a profound conservatism that is at the heart of participating in that discourse. And that's feels almost inescapable in a certain way. So that needs to be thought through. I think in this debate we recently saw with Adam Tooze, the liberal economist, where he chastised Marxism in a way which was even more reductive than Michel Foucault, as limited, he said, because it only concerns itself with problems of the 19th century. Well, of course, this is easily can be easily rebuked insofar as we have something called dialectical materialism, which is about construction of knowledge, which is not necessarily only of historical basis. But moreover, what he was really saying, I think, if you read it symptomatically, he's really trying to say that we lack, sanctioned Marxist priests that would come from the liberal academy. And to that, I would say good, because I don't think that Marxism will be regenerated off of that old model. That's exactly what Jacoby is talking about, of the subtitle of his book, The Age of Academia. I think that regeneration of Marxist and socialist intellectual life has to find a way out from starting it in the university, sprouting it from there. And I think that Tooze shot himself in the foot. Well, he didn't shoot himself in the foot because he's not a Marxist, but to even adopt his point of view is falling into the kind of fatalism of the academic authority complex. But it still resolves a real question. Maybe this is solvable through the construction of socialist civil society groups, more robust reading and study groups, the development of presses that can escape rivalrous conditions and actually produce at a higher scale writers, like Zero tried to do. Things like that would be more viable avenues. Within all of that, I don't think I would agree with your point that our generation will not produce a Gramsci. I don't know where a sentiment like that would come from, because we very well could. We very well could. Also because Gramsci's genius is bound up with the practice and historical context of his time. It's in a constant dialectical response to it. It's not as if he's a subtracted, it's not an aristocratic theory of genius that we rely on. I'm curious if you could answer that further. Like, what do you mean by that? Do you mean to say that the socialist movement doesn't have the resources institutionally to cultivate that kind of talent? I don't think we have a deficit in talent.
Talent's not the problem. The context is a problem. Like, if you ask yourselves, like, what are the cultural projects that the Communist Party did in America, or the Socialist Party did in America before 1930? The Communist Party, we have a very clear example. It was actually the main supporter of the Black Arts movement, particularly during the 1950s. That's why whenever you have some liberal darling ex-communist Black writer, you actually look at their history, and almost all of them were communist in the 40s and 50s, like almost to a man and woman. Lorraine Hansberry, for example, being one of the female variants of that.
Like Paul Robeson, for example.
And Paul Robeson. I mean, even Richard Wright and
definitely
James Baldwin, even though they cut with it up, even one of the most conservative of Black writers, Ralph Ellison, all had relationships with the Communist Party. My thing today, though, is that while actually existing socialism is a thing we can look to and learn from and should, there is no common term, there is no common form, there is no international movement of any size. So that is something we have to build up. We also have, since the 1940s, been stuck in this tension between becoming left populist and being ineffective but popular for the most part. And I mean ineffective in a very strict way. Many things left populist promise are not possible. I do not mean that they aren't preferable or they're good. They're not possible. Like, yes, socialized medicine is very possible. We've seen every capitalist country do it. Absolutely true. UBI and still maintaining a market economy without inflation, not possible. Just not. And it's not because the amount of money, it's not, I'm not a monetarist on why inflation exists exactly. It's a multi-determinant thing. But we know that it would, if there's a UBI, it would never be enough to liberate anyone, because why would your oppressors give you enough to liberate you? Well, it just doesn't make any sense, because then you could seize their technology from them, their fixed capital, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You might go, what does this have to do with Gramsci? Okay. We have to, it is our task as a generation, in my mind, as public intellectuals, as Marxists, as union organizers, whatever we are, to reconstruct the various parts of the socialist milieu, which means reconstructing the institutions that made a party possible, because without reconstructing those institutions and movements, we get sex. We know that. We know it. We've seen it happen over and over again. Everybody thinks we need a party. No one knows how to bring one about. All right? We know that our mission also is to reconstruct intellectual life for the worker in some way, and to engage with them non-condescendingly as an authority, but not an authority that speaks down, and one that listens. I think, however, we have to then look at the state of the American proletariat and the Western proletariat, because the conditions that we have seen, and that social democrats in particular have taken as a given, which is stable employment, formal institutions, large factory-style jobs, skilling and literacy, are being slowly undone before us. So yes, we could produce another Gramsci in that we could have someone think about what it takes to build these things. And Gramsci existed in a time that these things were being built. But they had been built for 60 years by the time he entered into that scenario.
Well, exactly. I was going to say a slight caveat to the latter point you said, which is they had been building for decades prior.
Right.
But he emerges at a moment where revolutionary rupture is on the horizon, it's on the table.
Correct.
So in a sense, we probably are less okay. So in that sense, I see your point. Although that doesn't necessarily mean we don't have the means to cultivate Marxist theorists. Perhaps our analogs are off, or perhaps like the type of Marxist theorist we needs to be rethought, because there's a difference between a strategist and I think a theorist. But also, like, I think Marxists should make alliances with literary critics, because even though literary critics often are highly fickle in terms of their political persuasion, when there is a flirtation that they have with Marxist ideas, this can actually be a source of something quite profound in a certain way. That's why I was always very enamored with this Christian Lorenzen figure who's trying to concoct a literary community in Manhattan under what they call Dimes Square. And it's largely become a kind of strange reactionary brew of odd things emerging there. It's a whole separate topic, but well, I guess it's quite related actually. But So yeah, no, I see your point. I see your point, and I suppose, I suppose we should say something about the Wallerstein essay, only because we haven't mentioned it. And just, I think there's a related point I wanted to tease out here and get your thoughts on, which is the idea of spontaneity. So Wallerstein says something interesting, which is that the task of the intellectual in a liberal society is to do three things: promote what he calls intellectual debunking, which is kind of like to push as much and pry as much as you can to upset core doxa, core assumptions that are foundational, and to show how they are in fact false. Say, for example, that access to education on the basis of performance is like some, the meritocracy. The meritocracy can be achieved in liberal society. This is a task of the intellectual to debunk. Second, he says militant collective action. But then he says something very, I think, important, which is what the 60s introduced was a break from socialist state party formations, and the left has really not been able to create a foothold of its own as anything other than spontaneous militant action against a form of authority that they're constantly pushing against. And he says some interesting things here about the kind of dialectic of militant collective action, in which there's these limits, but he doesn't say anything about how we know we've hit the limit. Insofar as what the communization theorists talk about spontaneous collective action of civil society, he's like, this is essential. He thinks it's essential because it too pushes the liberal center to the left. So he's working on this kind of liberal gradualist social change paradigm. And then third, personal liberation. So personal liberation, he thinks, is interesting. You know why? And this is interesting if you think about it to today's time, because he thinks the discourses on personal liberation in all of their multiplicity, from sexual revolution of the 60s and so on, effectively politicized the field of the person, the personality. And he felt that this injected left-wing ideology into the intimate spheres of public life. And he thinks this is a good. He thinks this is positive. But again, he talks about limits. So I'm just wondering if Wallerstein's three forms are kind of empty, or sort of relics of the 20th century, or whether we should even be thinking in this like liberal dialectic any longer. That's what I got from his essay. It's like, I'm not sure that your model is actually efficacious anymore.
Well, I was thinking about this in terms of a little bit, because it's relevant to our points about October 7th. I'll just read these two paragraphs. They can operate within liberal society in a way effectively to affect the liberal center, to push it leftward, to force it conscious of the real social choices, to appeal to its conscience and to its self-interest. The American left, under such circumstance, could ally itself with the liberal center when it is profitable and combat it when it is necessary, which is also like, that's the classical Popular Front strategy, to be quite frank. But anyway, next point. But I have not spoken of the problem of third world movements, but that is mutandis mutandis, the problem the left faces concerning them, and similar in many ways to those of concerning the liberal center. These movements are left in orientation because they are emancipations. They are emancipations of oppressed ethnic groups. But they contain many conservative elements because the need for group unity. The left must learn to support these movements and unite them when appropriate, but also disassociate itself from them when their conservative elements gain control. This is a delicate and difficult task, and one which requires both knowledge and empathy to do well, but in fact, it can be done. And I was thinking about this because I was thinking, like, I'm not a third worldist. I don't want people to think I am, but I do think there is a real sense that the duty of every leftist is, if they're going to be a duty of every Marxist. I don't know that I can task duties to leftism, whatever that is. It's a directional metaphor, but is to deal with the dialectic of dealing with class groups and other oppressed groups, that their need for unity and survival necessarily inculcates conservative elements, which could damage and hurt the left as a whole. We have to deal with them, and we cannot just make excuses for them, but we cannot push these people away. And when I think about this in liberal society, I actually go, well, has liberal society atomized to the point that there is no subject for us to really glom onto? After all, as you know, we think about some of the points that he makes about personal liberation, sexual liberation, etc. What we've seen with sexual liberation is it become a way of total alienization that removes gender and sex solidarity, or if you think they're the same thing, gender solidarity. I'll be fair to people. That leads to, 1/8 of the population being non-socially reproductive in any sense of the word. And OnlyFans being the site that more people spend any time on than anything else. And I don't say that to stigmatize sex work or anything like that. That's not my point. My point is very clearly that we have seen the things that people utilized as means of solidarity. People are oppressed by their families all the time, but I don't think anymore breaking the family up is experienced by the average working class person as anything other than a class good they don't have.
We've talked about this before. Okay.
But this is delicate. It is delicate.
It is very delicate.
Right.
Yeah.
It's incredibly delicate because we also don't want to valorize the bourgeois family or pre-bourgeois family even for its own sake. The point is understanding relationality and the points of relationality in both social reproduction and the production of self. And on this point, I think we do have to walk a delicate thing. I don't want to throw liberationist ideas under the bus to appear to socially conservative things that look like they're socially solidifying, because they will also eat us. But I do think we have to acknowledge that the liberalism that we could join up with in the 60s has commodified these forms of liberation to the point that they are actually inducing a social reproduction crisis that not just threatens the social future, it threatens their own.
And a lot of that, I think, will be metabolized through time. And some of these things will, one of the things that's very interesting, I would sort of posit, is that it used to be that political mutations went with like a general wind or a general series of events that shifted people to become more conservative. Now it doesn't seem as if events move us ideologically as much as inclusion into sub communities do, or into some kind of influencer transferential relationship does. And in that sense, we see, and this is something that I think Sennet talks about, politics as intimization. So there's these kind of there's a kind of loss of this idea that history is happening external to us, and there's a concurrent to that loss, a sense that we do not trust the testimony of one's own self-reporting or analysis on political realities that affect them, such that we can challenge, I don't know, certain forms of thinking that influence us. Say, for example, this idea of what you're talking about, the commodification of old forms of liberation now kind of becoming deleterious. I would contend that people don't interpret that as an old form of liberation. Perhaps this internalization of it is it's dehistoricized. So it's not as if, and perhaps that is the Marxist education that would be needed, which would be the historicization and the disentangling of these discourses of liberation, tracing them back to the historical purpose that they're founded in a certain way. That's why, for me, I've always been so interested in Marxist counterculture, Marxist bohemia, to see how far back it went into late 19th century, turn of the 20th. It's not a 60s thing at all. It's far
like an 1880s thing and an immigrant leadership of the various parties thing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. So there is a way in which a lot of these discourses are commodified, to be sure, but there needs to be injected into that commodification some type of critic. I mean, the whole notion of being a critic has to also possess a universality unto itself. This is part of my challenge with Chu's use of Kant and this idea of, we need the authoritarian critic.
Mhm.
No, fuck that. Kant's whole point is that everyone becomes a critic. Kant's point is not that we need an upper crust of critics. It's not the basis of his argument on what is enlightenment. It's much more universal. You know what I'm saying? Okay, sure, it's property owning white men at that time. But with an imminent reading, we can expand that for sure and make a much more egalitarian reading of Kant, of course. You see my point. So I'm not sure that we've talked about this in the wonderful conversation we had on the challenges facing the working class family in that article I wrote for Ion, where we looked at the kind of degraded basis of where the sexual revolution has landed us. What I find problematic is that the critics are no longer self-critical, right? So like the milieu upon which those 3 or 4 examples we cited of Chu, Kendi, and Coates, to some extent I see self-criticism, but what I would love to see is a sense of like a serious interrogation into where first and foremost, the class foundation that makes their worldview possible, but also what accounts for this kind of hyper, almost like petty bourgeois retreat. In other words, where's duty? Where's the role of duty in the critic's vocation? Right? Where's duty? Who are you bound to? I mean, at least in Marxism, we have a pretty clear sense of that. Right? I have the sense that the petty bourgeois critic has no sense of duty to a class formation at all. I
don't even know what duty they have, period, other than to the I'm going to sound like Lester McIntyre, the emotive winds that currently go through their milieu.
Exactly.
I mean, they might have a duty to an abstract notion of the oppressed, but even who counts as that is not defined. It is always a vague term.
And the thing with that is that when you have this vague solidarity with the oppressed, the problem that I have is that the right seizes on that lack of universalism in your discourse and they pervert it from within. Only a universalist position on this issue would not permit the right to do that. How could they? So there's that dimension too, which is this kind of violence at the heart of bourgeois ideology, of this kind of self-selection of the oppressed. It's a breeding ground for reactionary co-optation, if I'm quite honest. I'm not blaming them for that. but it is an effect that should be analyzed. I'm sorry to say.
To quote my friend Pascal Robert, how many more conservatives got way more mileage out of invoking Kimberly Crenshaw than any liberal or leftist got out of using her scholarship? And I will say this as a person who even defends early Crenshaw scholarship. I don't think it's useless, but critical race theory was an accompanied boogie word. There are times when Abraham X. Kendi was speaking where I was like, you couldn't create a better stereotype for this. And even though he was critiquing, and I think we forget this,
right?
Kendi was critiquing the liberal shibboleths of the 90s and early aughts, like power plus privilege equals racism, which even he said was ridiculous.
Right.
Like, because there's no race in the concept of racism.
One of the things that Jacoby gave me an idea of is if we think about a socialist republic of letters, in a basic sense, he makes a very basic point, but I think it actually is worth saying, which is that a big reason that bourgeois critics don't have a critique of capitalism is because the precondition to be a bourgeois critic is premised on the fact that you're not going to complain at the level of economics regarding your existence because you are so lucky to do this as a vocation, and you better damn well know that you're lucky to be here. Now, that logic permeates academia as well, and it puts the academic in a weird position because on the one hand, they're sort of forced to parrot suffering that's outside or kind of obscure or codified over there or other than. Whereas my sense of a socialist republic of letters would kind of be able to circumvent that. And therefore, this ressentiment problem would be sidelined in theory, right? It's something that I thought about, because that pressure could be loosened. And it is a real pressure. And it's also why the bourgeois academy is so, but not only bourgeois academy, but like the bourgeois field of letters itself prefers that the critic be pauperized effectively or paid very little, because qualitatively they have a recognition that what they are doing is sort of such a high prestige. So that's still quantified in a certain way, just not monetarily. So that's a kind of ruse that I've always felt is something worth saying and maybe obvious, but real. Well, we've been going for over 2 hours, and it's been very interesting. We didn't talk about Richard Sennet's book too much, in part because I didn't quite like it, frankly. I felt like it was repetitive, and there was that other issue of like the writing style was a bit dumbed down too much for my liking, so it lacked criticality in a certain way. And I also have questions about his core commitment to the narcissism thesis itself, which I felt was a little undeveloped. But the other readings I found super stimulating and actually quite challenging.
I love most of Russell Jacoby's work. I'm also a big fan of his Dialectics of Defeat, even though I criticized his chapter on French Maoism and Sartre. But that in a kind of response to Gabriel Rockhill's High Pastor Away from Marxism and the Resurgence of Domenico Huserto, and the translation of that book has come up quite a bit, so I don't need to tell people to read it as much anymore. I think what I like about Jacoby is he actually does tend to he grounds historiography in history, and I know that sounds like obvious, but I'll translate that to normal speak for our audience. He takes the concepts that we use to talk about history and puts them in a historical context themselves, so that we know, for example, that Western Marxism, Jacoby doesn't start it with intellectuals. He starts it with the K.A. Payday and, like actual things going on in Germany in the 1920s. And the party history that led to Karl Korsch, not just his writings later on. I think that kind of thing is something that we need desperately more of. We have gotten it between Neil Harding and Lars Lee on Lenin, but we haven't gotten it on most. And of course, we get it on Engels and Marx. Thank you, any number of people that we've already mentioned. On other shows that we've done together, Hal Draper, all kinds of people. Draper has this problem, by the way. Don't take any of these scholars as definitive. But I have been thinking more about this because I think, my duty has been increasingly to historicize what we're doing so that we can start parsing the difference between now and the early 20th or 19th century in a realistic way without trying to degrade the entire history of socialism, be it actually existing socialism or socialism in the Western countries.
Yeah. No, I think that's good. I mean, I think Jacoby is also a figure who tries to reinterrogate the plausibility of liberation narratives at the kind of conjuncture of theory and how theory meets its kind of often blind attempt at expression or utterance in a given historical moment. Meaning, like, in other words, there's a common problem, especially in the American left, of a dynamic of gauging the proper strategic valence by which to capture the profound agitation and class consciousness that is somehow inert or somehow unexpressible, and to provide an analysis as to why that impossibility exists, right? As to, like, that itself is very valuable. In other words, a study of the historical basis of political impotence is valuable, right? A study of the failures of the left is also quite useful. I think, obviously, within certain boundaries, and because that then can become its own sideshow. But Jacoby balances that critique of the left from within the left pretty damn well. I liked my interview with him on Lo Cerdo's book. He was quite surgical, and it was interesting. The things that that he brought out are quite useful. But I mean, we're coming to an end with the intellectual series. I suppose it would be useful to ask, what other topics do comrades want for Derick and I to investigate? I would like to do this again. It's always good to choose something that is close to what we're writing on, working on, so it kind of dovetails naturally with what we're already interested in pursuing. I don't know if any thoughts come to mind. We can also think on it. But certainly I would love to do another series. I thought this was very enjoyable. It seems like folks got a lot out of it, from my community and from yours as well. Any thoughts?
I'd love to hear what the community has to say. I've thought about the history of left populism and non-anarchist, non-Marxist socialism, because it keeps on like rearing its weird head. And there's a lot of Marxist today. Today we have like Marxist monetary theory, or Marxist modern monetary theory. Excuse me. There is also Marxist monetary theory. That's a different thing. We have third worldism. These sorts of things are interesting to me because I find when I actually do their reception history, I could go into what these terms meant at what time and where, I become both more and less sympathetic to them simultaneously. That, like, I start seeing, oh, well, this term meant something different here. So anything you guys, that either of our communities would be interested in, I would love to know what you want us to do a deep dive in. We kind of did that with the dictatorship of the proletariat with 2 texts.
Yeah.
Really 3 texts. And also, guys, you could take this as an ersatz reading list because we'll generate reading lists for you for this stuff too.
That's very true. Yeah. I think well, a couple of things. One is I'm obviously writing a book right now on issues related to the American working class and proletariat and sort of doing an ethnographic sociological study on that level. I'm also planning to immerse myself in Lash's archives in Rochester. So that could also be something that we could unearth and discuss some of the things that we didn't know that maybe I touch upon or uncover in that. That could be interesting for us. I think more analysis and clarity into the history of imperialism would be very useful, given that it's elevated to such a central topic, but often very, very poor. I mean, even in like Lenin's theories of imperialism, there's a lot of illiteracy about that. That would be useful.
Yeah, I actually wanted to do a series one time where I went through the different meanings of imperialism in Marxist literature because it actually does change meanings, and it's often not just solving the problem of imperialism. Like for Bukharin and Lenin, it's also solving other
monopoly capitalism. Yeah.
Monopoly capitalism, and but also the tension between the decline of the rate of profits to fall and the development of monopoly capitalism through the socialization of the joint stock company. Both are things mentioned in Engels and Marx explicitly, and people could not reconcile them. So, part of what imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism is trying to reconcile is both answer people like Hobson who go, oh, imperialism's bad, but it's not capitalism. It's just new mutation. It's something different. But also answer Marxists like Hilferding, who were saying that, like, oh, we can just build monopoly powers and all we have to do is democratically take control of the state. And then ipso facto, we have socialism without that much of a necessary revolution, even though, and that's not the Bernstein thesis. That's a different thing. You still see it. There are people today who have tried to resurrect this theory.
That would be good. I would also say and add, I'd like to catapult into post decolonization dependency theory, Samar Amin, world systems theory, the decline of imperialism within Marxism in David Harvey, Hart and Negri, all of that. Like I'd also like the historical, stretching back, what is imperialism for Marx and Engels, up through, Second International into Leninism.
Yeah, why did half the world system theorists abandon Marxism? That
would be, I think, a very useful, looking through. And John Bellamy Foster. That's the other thing, actually. Here's a viable project to think about. I'm doing some work with Foster right now on his new book on materialism and atomism in Marxism, and it's had me think that I might turn to a group study, a collective study on Lucretius and Greek atomism and its importance for Marx in his dissertation, and then beyond, building off of Foster's study, but like going beyond, because what interests me about that is that I was trained in post-structuralists, Badiou and the French people, and they have their own interpretation of Marxist atomism and materialism that's quite different than what Foster is developing. And so I'm also going to be organizing some programs of debate on this issue. So that's another possibility of analysis, of kind of looking back at the history of materialism.
I would love actually to do something about what Marxists mean by materialism, because it isn't It isn't monism the way like Richard Dawkins means it.
Yeah, because then we could read the foundational texts from Plekhanov on the monist, what is it? The monist perspective of history, something like this. You know, some of these even
Yeah, and then imperial criticism, my most
criticism, but
yeah.
even like, you know, the rapprochement between Spinoza and Marx. My favorite, you know, Dietzkin has a whole thing on this. So that could be a fruitful, a kind of more philosophical, and I might actually.
I interviewed Christoph Stringer, who's also been on your show, but on a different thing. We talked about Marx's relationship to Epicurean and Democritus, and some of the weirder parts of his of the fragments of his dissertation. We don't actually have the whole thing, because it didn't exist; it wasn't finished. That exist because I think it does clarify. I think John Barronley Foster is actually right that it will clarify some things about Marxist materialism, and the reason why this has come up for me, so I guess we've given ourselves several projects we could pick on, but like you've seen this turn on materialism from some of the salvage school in Britain.
Yeah.
Richard Seymour, who's written actually some stuff like,
yeah,
China Mieville in particular, but also Richard Seymour has written some interesting stuff on Spinoza and how Spinoza is not doing the same thing as Marx. That I think is interesting, but I kind of want to refute. I don't really. I mentioned the Seymour because I actually found the China Mieville to be somewhat confused on definitions. I feel like he used 5 different forms of consciousness in that essay, and even sometimes pointed out that they didn't mean the same thing, but then continued to talk about them as if they did. But anyway,
I noticed that too. Yeah, it was a bit imprecise. Yeah, no, so that could be a very fecund mode of research that I would very much enjoy. That.
Yeah.
All right, good. So maybe we'll put out like a poll or something.
Yeah, we'll put out a poll of some things we could do.
Hey, well, Derick, thank you for this. I thought we got a lot out of this, especially the Chu piece got us thinking, and I thought it was excellent.
I actually, people who think I'm being hard on Chu, I actually really like reading it.
Yeah.
And I thought I was gonna feel by it about the way I do about what's that critic from a similar milieu? She wrote "Men Talking to Me," Rebecca Solnit or something,
Right.
and I was gonna get mad and throw it against the room, against the wall because Solnit was published by a Marxist press, so yeah. Wild. So
no, for sure. No, Chu. If Chu is listening to our conversation, I thought that your work was very noteworthy. I mean, the style is very refreshing, precisely in the sense that as a critic, she was able to definitely communicate to that everyman reader. And bravo, you know,
yeah.
you've successfully transcended the confines of the age of academia. Thank God. So that's noteworthy and praiseworthy in and of itself. And frankly, all of this stuff, we should get tougher skin. I mean, you know, anyone that's going to be talking about your work, and I've heard people talk about my work before, and it's very weird. It's almost impossible to listen to. But, you know, like there should be some, I don't know, just basic humility there. That even a strong critique, I don't know, what's the problem with that? I don't know. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know.
Well, I actually do. I actually do think maybe we do have to be somewhat
Diplomatic,
humble and diplomatic, but also like I've had people who've just reamed me out who I thought actually had a good point. And I actually do think it is important as a thinker to be like, well, okay, I didn't think this through enough, or, what I tend to get mad at is when I'm misinterpreted. But even then, I mean, like, as a speaker, because I speak more than I write now. I used to write more, but that's a long time ago. I have to admit that if many people are misunderstanding what I'm saying, it's kind of my fault.
Yeah, but that doesn't happen much. I doubt that happens too much.
It happens more than you'd suspect. But there are some times where I think it's just, people construct, like, for example, it's funny because I've weighed in on things like Gabriel Wackel's book, and I have been pegged as someone on both sides of that debate.
Yeah.
And I'm not. I'm just trying to explain, like, hey, there's parts of this that are very serious.
Well, I was recently on a podcast, and then somebody hosted somebody else on the same podcast who's critical of a line of theory that I like, and they interpreted that person as being passive aggressive to me. But then I was like, wait a second, just stop and reflect on how you are conceiving of intellectual authority. It's like we are little servants to master thinkers that define us. No,
I mean,
no, that's not how it is. I mean, maybe that's my age, speaking here, but I don't know. It's too cliquish.
I think about that too. Like, people aren't surprised that I have anything negative to say about Christopher Lasch. Like, you've devoted so much of your life to understanding him, and I'm like, yeah, and I think he's brilliant. I also think there are some key things in which he is very, very wrong.
Right.
Not on air, but one thing I'll tell you about the response to some of his students to me at a conference when I read a paper on him. I'll mention it.
Okay, now we're gonna really close because I got to hear this.
All right.
Thank you all, comrades. Thank you so much. Until next time, peace out, everybody.